And you make it sound as though only a perennial optimist could take this position. Well, thank you for the invitation to come tonight. I set the topic of advancing development in an era of multiple crises. I should have said keeping schedules on a day of multiple meetings is just about as challenging, but it's one of those weeks at the UN. But I accepted because I know that the Foreign Policy Association for more than 90 years has been a very important forum for debate and discussion on foreign policy. And coming from a background of many years in public life in my own country, I know how important it is to have organisations like this which do help stimulate informed debate about global issues. And that debate should not only be conducted in the corridors of governments, think tanks, the UN, the halls of academia. It does need active citizen engagement, informed engagement, and I think you're very much part of that process of trying to bring a broader understanding of the critical issues of our time. So, to my topic, International Development Goals, an Era of Multiple Crises. Think back 9 years to the Millennium Summit of the United Nations, and I guess with the dawn of a new millennium, everyone feels optimistic. Can we make this century better than the last? Actually, the 21st century hasn't got off to a terribly good start. In just the last 2 years alone, there have been the food and the fuel crises, and I'm told, by the way, food prices are very much on the move up again. The global recession we're so familiar with, the major climatic events, other extraordinary natural disasters, now the flu pandemic. But I think back to 2000 and coming here myself as a head of government, signing the Millennium Declaration, it was a time of hope. The 8 Millennium Development Goals, now accredited by the UN Intellectual History Project as among the leading ideas which really justify the worth and place of the UN. Those goals were a collective commitment about a better tomorrow for literally billions of people. Goals on reducing poverty and hunger, empowering women, increase access to essential services like education, healthcare, clean water and sanitation, and forging strong global partnerships for development. Who could be against such things? Achieving those goals is to achieve very, very basic and important and essential indicators of development. But here we are with the multiple crises, and I know that the crises challenge developed countries as well. Certainly the small country that I came from felt every single one of them. Try fighting election campaigns in the middle of a recession, food prices spiking, fuel prices spiking, erratic climate in a country which depends on agriculture for a lot of its earnings, etc. So if a country like mine feels it, if a great nation like the United States feels so many of these pressures, think then how much greater the impact is on the poor and vulnerable nations of our world. And I guess the fact that we all feel those shocks reminds us that it's in all our interests to support the least developed countries to develop that all-important resilience to withstand the shocks, which will keep coming. And it's all very well to say that that we could have predicted a lot of the shocks which have beset our world. Actually, we didn't, and we're dealing with the consequences, and many of our neighbours do not have the resources to effectively deal with the consequences. So I'm under no illusion about the scale of the challenge of development at this particular time. But then, meeting development challenges never was particularly easy. And in meeting them now, I'd like to focus on 3 things, and I'll comment on these tonight. Number 1, which I'll return to, is it would certainly help if the promises which have been made on official development assistance were fulfilled. I don't say official development assistance is a panacea for development. It's only ever part of the equation. But it can be, and it must be, moving forward, a very catalytic part of the equation, supporting the step changes in developing countries, in governance, in smart strategies, and in building the capacity that is required for nations to transform their prospects. Secondly, I'll comment on the need for a new development paradigm to be widely articulated, which combines the development goals we're also familiar with, like those set out in the Millennium Development Goals, with environmental objectives and programs so that we can truly achieve long-term and sustainable development. And my third point will be that we need to reinvigorate global partnerships for development so that we take into account a lot more new geopolitical realities, the role of the South in cooperation in the South, and the greatly expanded role which both the philanthropic and private sectors are playing in development. Now, to the context of the development challenge. Prior to the global recession, while there were a lot of pressures, food, fuel, climate, disaster, actually significant progress had been made on a lot of the Millennium Development Goals. But even so, as many as 1 billion people worldwide seemed likely to remain in extreme poverty in 2015. This was before the global recession, and a lot of countries were off track on key targets. So now we have a set of extra challenges arising from the recession, and concern that the progress which has been made could not just stall, but actually reverse without some concerted effort. And that is already apparent when we look at the numbers of those who are living in hunger. Before the global food crisis hit in 2007, the number of chronically hungry people in developing countries stood at around 850 million. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, FAO, believes that number will go over 1 billion this year. So it's already quite a significant impact. And between 2005 and 2008, we saw 200 more million people pushed into extreme poverty. This is largely before the impact of the global recession was felt on developing countries. But it was that combination of the food price spikes, the fuel price spikes, which were helping drive people into extreme poverty. So where from here? Well, the latest IMF projections released this month have revised the global growth rates upwards. Even so, the emerging and developing economies are still projected to grow by only 1.7% this year, and that's down from 6% last year. We're looking at a sluggish recovery, an uneven and uncertain recovery, and how wise, in my view, the G20 was to emphasise that a rapid exodus from stimulus packages would actually really threaten the rather uncertain recovery that we're starting to see out there at the moment. Looking ahead another year to 2010, it's thought that growth in the developing countries will go over 5%. That is mainly driven by developing countries in Asia, and of course within that, largely driven by China. China's economy is forecast to grow by 9% in 2010. That's almost twice the rate that's forecast for developing countries as a whole. Now, I emphasise again, developed countries have been hit hard by this recession as well. Living in the United States now, one cannot fail to be daily aware of that, and of the really heartrending stories that one sees from people who've lost their jobs, and with it their health insurance and their stability and the ability to keep their home. At the macro level, though, in developed countries, there are tools at a nation's disposal with which to respond, and we've seen these quite extraordinarily large sums provided for fiscal stimulus and financial bailouts, which have helped shore up not only national economies, but in the case of what has gone into the IMF, actually underwritten the stability of the global financial system, which is so important. But out there in the world of developing countries, many, particularly the least developed, just don't have deep pockets to dip into to cushion the blow of the recession to their economies, and nor is it that easy for them to borrow. So we're looking at poverty probably increasing significantly in a number of those countries. particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where real GDP per capita is projected to contract this year, and that will be the first decline in a decade. It's coming because export revenues have crashed, the inflow of investment and remittances is down. The IMF estimates that gross foreign direct investment flows into low-income countries will fall by around 25% this year as compared to last. And remittances are certainly down. The picture is a little uneven across regions. It's hitting Africa particularly, not Asia so much. There seems to be less effect on the remittances out of the Gulf countries. But around 80% of Africa's remittances, I understand, come from developed countries. And when Europe goes into crisis with very high unemployment, when South Africa's economy is badly hit, this is really affecting the flow of remittances back into Africa. So a particular concern that we have at UNDP is that where you get profound economic crisis in vulnerable countries, that can then extend into a humanitarian crisis, and at worst can also precipitate instability and then outright conflict. And at that point, the consequences are long-lasting and far more expensive in every sense to remedy, ultimately at a much greater cost to the country affected and to the international community than timely support in the hour of need would have been. And this highlights to me another very important aspect of the development equation, that promoting peace and stability is absolutely critical for development to ensue, and is something that we need to underwrite more effectively and more proactively. Indeed, the risks of instability may increase further in the next few decades if there are growing tensions over managing natural resources, including a resource as basic to life as water. We're living in an increasingly water-constrained age. Conflict itself, of course, has lasting negative impacts on human development as it destroys lives, livelihoods, communities, and infrastructure. I'm still struck by the first visit I made to Liberia in June this year, and to go to a city of over 1 million people, roughly the same size as my home city in New Zealand, and at night to see just the flickering lights from the generators across that city because the power supply, the hydro supply was taken out during the Civil War, is a pretty sobering experience. That's what conflict, prolonged conflict, can produce for a country. It takes a long time to come back from that. And then what we also focus a lot on in UNDP is the need for rapid and early recovery once a conflict has technically ended. Because without that early peace dividend, it's all too easy for the conflict to start again. And we work tirelessly in conflict zones around the world, whether it's Afghanistan, so much on our minds at the moment, to Somalia, where we do have 200 people on the ground and a program worth about $73 million. From Haiti to Sudan, where we're there, where we can, disarming, demobilising, reintegrating former fighters, trying to support families and communities to build a livelihood again, get the rule of law established to the extent that we can, and, a critical issue for the UN these days, play our part in combating the scourge of violence against women. And sad to say, in so many of the conflicts, the war doesn't end for women when the conflict itself ends. The pattern of gender-related sexual violence has become well established often during the actual period of conflict, and it does go on and on. It's a huge, huge concern which the UN is very, very active on. But, of course, to do our job, to support development, we need resources, and so do developing countries. On paper, the commitments are all there to provide more support for development, but we are seeing a rather long lag between commitment and delivery. One set of commitments, which was very high profile, came out of the G8 in Glen Eagles, in 2005. The G8 said, "We pledge that aid to developing countries will increase by 2010 by $50 billion a year. Specifically, we will double aid to Africa between 2004 levels and 2010. And every year the G8 meets and it reaffirms this pledge. The problem is 2010 is next year, and the pledge for Africa is over 80% under delivery. So it's very hard to plan and strategise when your hopes are lifted by obviously a headline-grabbing commitment such as that out of Gleneagles in 2005, but really the money does not come through. And I just underline again that while money isn't everything, I happen to think that peace and stability and good governance and non-corruption and transparency and all these other aspects, the software of development, if you like, are incredibly important. Nonetheless, money does help, and it does help us to support the building and strengthening of capacities and institutions within countries which make sustainable development possible. And from the point of view of developing countries, it certainly helps them build their resilience. And if we can focus on these medium and long-term development issues and goals, we wouldn't in the future need to respond so often and in such a piecemeal manner to crisis. But often at the moment we feel we're like a dog chasing our tail from one crisis to another. And we do increasingly see our donors spending more on humanitarian relief operations in very, very fragile states. But in those states, I stress we need to move to early recovery and development as fast as we possibly can, and nor should we be neglecting the development needs of the currently stable but still poor countries. They may be coping now, but they have rather a lot to cope with as these shocks come one after another. So, to my second point, if we are to tackle development in the midst of multiple crises, we can't apply old development paradigms. In particular, the environment was given far too little consideration, in my view, in the past. Witness the rather weak focus on it in the Millennium Development Goals and the failure of the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002 to set ambitious targets. I was at that summit as well, and it was really quite disappointing how weak the targets and goals agreed on there were. But I believe it's absolutely critical now to be integrating climate and broader environmental considerations into our development thinking and planning. After all, the state of our ecosystem has a rather profound effect on the terms and conditions on which we all dwell on one planet. I was very struck by a figure attributed to World Bank calculations, which suggests that 40% of development investment now from official development assistance and from concessional lending is sensitive to climate risk. What does that tell us? That if we do not factor climate risk into development strategies and planning, then we are literally pouring our money, or a considerable portion of it, down the drain, and that is never a good principle. The climate crisis is undoubtedly one of the greatest ongoing challenges our world faces. It is a huge challenge to developing countries. A person in a developing country is, it's estimated, 79 times as likely to experience a climate disaster as someone in a developed country. People are bearing the brunt of climate extreme vulnerability and change now, and the indications are that that change is taking place faster than was previously predicted. For example, the recent calculations of the projected increase in global sea levels suggest a rise by 1 metre by the end of the 21st century compared with the end of this last century. That almost doubles the projection which was made only 2 years ago by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So these are extraordinarily serious issues. Again, the Intergovernmental Panel has suggested that without firm mitigation action now, and that's what hopefully a new climate agreement will be all about, certain crop yields in 2050 in a number of developing countries could be only half of their 2000 levels. Think what that will do to food prices. Last month we had here in New York at the General Assembly the Special Leader Level Climate Summit, convened by the Secretary General, with many leaders there and many making important statements. But everyone who's following these climate negotiations through to Copenhagen knows how difficult it has become to reach a quality new climate agreement in December. And for an agreement to be reached, it will have to be a good deal for development. I think this informed audience will be aware that the statements from Africa are that they regard the finance needed as compensation for what has occurred in the past. There are very strong positions being taken on this. The new agreement will need to support adaptation to climate change, to build greater resilience to that change, and it will need to support low carbon routes to growth and to energy access. So the funding for the agreement, when it's reached, and I'll be positive and say when, not if it's reached, I hope it doesn't become a long-running saga like the Doha WTO round. That would be too tragic. When it's reached, it will, I think, deliver significant resources for development, and it will be greener alternatives to development, and it will enable adaptation. Now, why the need for the extra funding in this area? Well, the reality is that the heavy carbon footprint route to development, the business as usual route we're all familiar with, is a less expensive route in the short term than the new route which requires the new technologies, the new ways of doing things, and countries will be needing support to put that route in place. And the same resource issue arises with adaptation, that the most vulnerable countries need significant support which will go above and beyond existing official development assistance. We're talking very large sums of money here. Gordon Brown put his toe in the water with an estimate of a fund required of $100 billion per annum, not next year, but building up to that. Immediately that figure was out, the estimates started to say, well, maybe you need 2.5 times that. When we're talking enormous sums of money, far greater sums of money eventually than we have seen traditionally flowing through official development assistance. So, the key message, I think, from me is that we have to integrate the traditional development goals around health and education and poverty and hunger, etc., with incredibly important moves on the climate and environmental issues. And I believe you can tackle both together and have a win-win, but it does require all stakeholders pulling in the same direction. No one actor can achieve the Millennium Development Goals, tackle climate change, or bring about peace and stability. But we can do together what we cannot do alone. Now let me come briefly to the third point I wanted to make this evening. The need for renewed partnerships for development, which take into account a lot of the changes on the development scene. There are major geopolitical shifts taking place in our world, and of course there are calls, and understandable calls, in many quarters for these to be reflected in the multilateral decision-making architecture. Now, just as there are these shifts geopolitically, in political, diplomatic, security terms, so there are in development. The south-south flows of finance and technology and know-how are now huge, to put it mildly. And the truth is that developing countries themselves have so many useful experiences, technologies, know-how available, which is relevant and can assist other countries in the south to meet their development challenges. and increasingly the emerging countries of the South are playing that role. And as we rethink our role at UNDP, and our role traditionally has been to receive funding from developed countries to put into place initiatives and programs in developing countries, while that funding remains absolutely essential, increasingly we are seeing ourselves as a knowledge organisation which will facilitate the sharing of experience across the South. For example, Egypt wanting to develop a social protection system for rural communities at the time of recession. UNDP as an organisation can point to relevant examples elsewhere in the world which might be worth studying, because you don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I suspect going forward we will be seen as a very, very important hub for that kind of exchange. We are also having it suggested to us by a number of the emerging donors that for the future they would like to partner with us in third countries. Many of the emerging donors are new to the task. They see UNDP on the ground as experienced, and they see a three-way combination with the program country as something that really appeals to them. These are donors who are deliberately standing outside the OECD Development Assistance Committee framework. They're doing it their way, but they want to do it right. They don't want to waste their taxpayers' money either. So we're going to increasingly play a role in that setup. There's also the issue of needing very, very good partnerships between the big multilateral development agencies like our own and the philanthropic funds and the private sector. When in the world of the past have we seen funds of the scale of, for example, the Gates Foundation, the amount of money that the Clinton Global Initiative can mobilise, and many, many other examples. These are huge, huge philanthropic funds. And then increasingly there's the interest by the private sector in the role that it can play. And at UNDP, we think this role goes beyond the traditional corporate social responsibility role, which is an important role and a charitable role. We have been involved in work which shows that including the poor in the core business strategies of corporations will work both for the businesses and it will work for development. The research we commissioned estimated that the world's poorest 4 billion people have a combined income of about $5 trillion. Well, that's rather a large market. And that led UNDP to develop what is called a Growing Inclusive Markets Initiative, promoting business models in which the pursuit of wealth creation by the business is entirely compatible with both human progress and development and environmental sustainability. And this is the basis of the business call for action, which Prime Minister Gordon Brown kindly helped launch, where we encourage companies to come forward and present these inclusive business models which are supportive of development while profitable for the corporation as central to their business model. Now, it's long been my view that the workings of the market alone will not end poverty. Of course it's important to have strong economies and growth, but that growth needs to be inclusive and it needs to be sustainable. The market left to itself doesn't deliver equity or justice. It's not its function. It's a question of the parameters we set around that. And this is where public policy and enlightened approaches from business, and we have many, many good examples, have a role to play, and where I think the multilateral development agencies can be particularly helpful in strategising. Across the UN development system, we have a global presence. We are in countries in good times and in bad. We were in Afghanistan long before a coup took out its monarchy, long before a long-running civil war, Taliban, the conflict that we've known since 2001. And when everybody's gone home, we'll still be there because there'll be a job to be done. We have been there in times good and bad. In the development system in the UN, we work with many partners on often work which is not that visible but absolutely underpins development prospects, like strengthening a country's ability to govern itself at the local level, the regional level, the national level, develop the capacities which will enable countries to actually implement fine strategies and policies and make a difference on the ground. We're very focused now on the run-up to the high-level event or summit on Millennium Development Goals that will be held at the UN in September next year, when the General Assembly meets with the new UN year. And a very high priority for us as the agency with the climate and development mandate will be to see that given full consideration as we look at how we accelerate progress on the Millennium Development Goals. We need to see climate and environment put at the very heart of countries' development strategies. So, as I've said, there are a lot of challenges out there right now, and I think all too often some of the medium-term and longer-term issues and needs get crowded out by the need to respond to the crisis of the day. And turning on BBC World every morning as I do, there is a crisis every day, and they're horrible and appalling crises. But it's our duty to keep a focus on the medium and the long-term goals and to be actively strategizing and working on the smart ways of achieving those goals and mobilising the resources to do it. And as an optimist, which is why I took this position, I think if we can get the resourcing right, if we can get the integrated strategies right, if we can help build those capacities in country for better and more transparent governance and underwrite peace and stability, we can get there. We can reach those goals. Perhaps I shouldn't say yes we can, but I know we can with everybody playing their part. Thank you very much.